Lacan's concept of the phallus. By the dangerous maybe. In this post, I want to discuss Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic concept of the phallus. This concept, like many of his other ones, can be very difficult to understand, and I want to try to make it as intelligible as possible. Due to its level of difficulty, it will take some work to flesh out the phallus. Sorry, I couldn't resist. My understanding of this concept is owed to Todd McGowan. He recently made an incredibly helpful YouTube video introducing the concept of the phallus, and he's also written a great commentary on Lacan's essay, The Signification of the Phallus, which is contained in Reading Lacan's Écrits. I've also learned a ton about Lacanian psychoanalysis from the podcast McGowan hosts with Ryan Engley, called Why Theory. While I'm definitely taking my cue from McGowan's exegetical insights, I'm going to be introducing this concept in my own words and providing as many examples as I can from religion, pop culture, and everyday experience. From there, we'll see how the phallus relates to politics, ideology, and comedy. The phallus has a fundamental impact on our identities, desires, fantasies, etc. And this is why it's so important to comprehend, especially if you're engaging in ideology critique, cultural theory, gender studies, and so on. Before getting underway with my own reflections on the concept, I just want to share the link to McGowan's video. I cannot overstate how helpful it has been to me, along with all his other YouTube videos. The phallus was one of the primary concepts Lacan was developing during the years of his 4th and 5th seminars, roughly 1956-58. And it was in this time period that he wrote The Signification of the Phallus, which has become one of the most influential essays in his Écrits. This concept plays an essential role in Lacan's concepts of the castration and Oedipus complexes, as well as in his early concept of sexual difference, the difference between man and woman. Due to this, and how Lacan specifically conceptualizes it, the phallus is very relevant to the study of gender, sex, etc. Lacan did, however, go on to emphasize the phallus less and less in his work. In fact, his later concept of the objet petit a, object cause of desire, came to occupy the main position in his theoretical architecture. Also, in Seminar 20, he would rethink the structure of sexual difference and the role the phallus plays in it, though the phallus does continue to play a role in sexuation. Here, I'll be focusing on Lacan's early theories of the phallus and sexual difference. Despite the fact that he would revise them later on, I still think there is a lot he got right with his earlier formulations, and that these insights can aid us in knowing how the world we live in functions. First things first, the phallus is not the penis. The distinction between the phallus and the penis is one of Lacan's most important contributions to the study of sexual difference and has major consequences for how we think about the relations between men and women. For Lacan, and this is his key insight, the phallus is a signifier. As he put, quote, "The phallus can be better understood on the basis of its function here. In Freudian doctrine, the phallus is not a fantasy, if we are to view fantasy as an imaginary effect. Nor is it as such an object, part internal, good, bad, etc., inasmuch as object tends to gauge the reality involved in a relationship. Still less is it the organ, penis or clitoris, that it symbolizes. And it is no accident that Freud adopted as a reference the simulacrum it represented ancients. For the phallus is a signifier whose function in the intrasubjective economy of analysis may lift the veil from the function it served in the mysteries. For it is the signifier that is destined to designate meaning effects as a whole, insofar as the signifier conditions them by its presence as signifier. End of quote. But what does all of this mean? What's so important about it? In saying that the phallus is a signifier, in holding it to not be identical to the penis, Lacan is undermining the fundamental presupposition of patriarchy, i.e., that men intrinsically have a power, authority, and superiority over women, precisely and simply because they have penises. In making a distinction, a cut between the phallus and the penis, Lacan is arguing that the higher position men have occupied in society is based on nothing more than a contingent simulation, on a bluff, on semiotic bullshit. As McGowan says, quote, by identifying the phallus as a signifier, it loses the aura of mystery that has always surrounded it. The phallus gains this aura of mystery because it is not just any signifier, but the signifier that signifies signification itself. That is, the phallus brings the whole field of meaning into existence. End of quote. This is what I want to explain throughout the rest of this blog post. I will be attempting to demystify the phallus by showing how it actually functions. Let's begin by clarifying what a signifier is, since Lacan and Lacanians use signifier ad nauseam. Now, it's not the constant usage of this word that is so annoying, but the fact that they use it all the time without ever bothering to properly explain it. Just saying that the phallus is a signifier isn't all that helpful if we don't really know what a signifier is. Lacan borrowed this term from the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who, in his course on general linguistics, defined a sign as a combination of a signifier and a signified. Let's use Saussure's famous example of the sign 3. For Saussure, a concept, a signified, was just one half of the binary structure of a sign, the other half being the word, i.e., the signifier that represents the signified. The word 3 represents the concept of a tree. When you see the signifier 3 and also its sound image, or when you hear someone say it, you immediately think of the general concept you have of trees. Saussure provided a diagram of this twofold structure of the sign. Arbor is the Latin for tree. According to Saussure, a sign, therefore, is a relation between a signifier, the material mark, and a signified, a mental image. The signifier is a material mark insofar as you either see it or hear it. That is, the signifier is perceived through the senses, whereas the signified is imagistic content in the mind. But Lacan, while deeply influenced by Saussure, would problematize this one-to-one correspondence between the signifier and the signified. This is not to say that he totally rejected Saussure's model of the sign, but he did revise it and limited its scope. Lacan knew that when we say the single signifier 3, it brings the signified 3 to mind, and therefore that there is truth to Saussure's concept of the sign. But he also knew that there was more to this semiotic process than meets the eye. And Lacan would go on to argue for the primacy of the signifier. The Saussurean sign, the one-to-one correspondence of signifier and signified, is actually a product of signifiers themselves. Lacan thought that the signified, or signification, is fundamentally produced through the interactions of signifiers. The example I like to use to illustrate the primacy of the signifier is that of rubbing two sticks together in order to produce fire. In this analogy, the two sticks are two signifiers, and the fire is the signified, or signification. It's only after we rub two signifiers together that we get the flames of meaning, or signified, or signification. Lacan often spoke of the point de capiton, or quilting point. What this refers to is how a signifier retroactively determines the meaning of the signifiers that came before it. Let's look at two different statements. Imagine someone looks at you and says, "I hope you have a happy life." Now imagine that the same person saying, "I hope you have a miserable life." The ending of each statement retroactively determines the meaning of its beginning. We see that happy life and miserable life are two drastically different quilting points. They change the very meaning of the I in each statement. The I of the first statement is someone who cares deeply for you, whereas the I of the second one is a person who hates your guts. The meaning of the I wasn't found in a one-to-one relation to its signified, but was actually in another signifier, i.e. either in happy life or miserable life. Molly Ann Rothenberg is very helpful with this concept of retroactivity or retroversion. Quote, "Retroversion is one of the most common but least acknowledged forces in human social relations. We encounter it in every use of language. When you read that Carl smiled as he gently stroked the velvety skin of his lover, you may find your initial picture of this apparent love scene altered irrevocably by the next phrase, with the keen edge of a knife. Using language means making constant adjustments as the field of meaning widens, narrows, and then circles back on itself. The opportunity and the need for such adjustments is ever present but has unpredictable effects. One person may be jolted out of a chain of associations, forced to re-evaluate the beginning of that chain by a word that has no particular effect on another person. It is easy enough to imagine a reader who would not read the first phrase as a love scene, but rather as the opening of a horror story. Such a person may not be vulnerable to the kind of blunt retroversion that would otherwise strike at the mention of the knife. At the same time, we could imagine another reader for whom every word in the first clause works backward to warp or inflect the word that preceded, even before the knife makes its appearance. For example, the reader might at first imagine a velvety skin to be referring to Carl's own body, and would then rework the whole scene from auto-stimulation to interpersonal sexual relations at the moment of encountering the word lover. But once the jolt occurs, the opening of the sentence, the opening that sets us up for the jolt down the line, will be transformed permanently in this retroversive movement. In a kind of Back to the Future scenario, the original causes, words such as smile and stroked, are altered in their significance by the effects they produce. Time seems to loop back on itself. The excessive subject, 1-2. The quilting point secures and anchors the signifiers which precede it, and thereby produces meaning. Or, as Lacan put it, the quilting point is where signified and signifier are knotted together. It's only after we've become extremely familiarized with a body of signifiers, for example, the English language, that we can talk of relative one-to-one correspondences between certain signifiers and signifieds. The point de capiton shows us that there are certain privileged signifiers in the field of signifiers that stabilize meaning and prevent it from sliding all over the place. As we will see, the phallus is an especially privileged signifier, insofar as it is the signifier of meaning itself. But more on that in a minute. Before we can see the importance of the phallus being a signifier, we need to get a fuller understanding of the three different types of relations that exist between the signifier and the signified. For this, we need to turn to the work of the American semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce. Saussure and Peirce were the founders of modern semiotics, and while they had much in common, they also emphasized different aspects of the sign. Peirce, unlike Saussure, made many topologies of the sign, and one of the most important of them is his threefold distinction between icon, index, and symbol. As he said, a sign is either an icon, an index, or a symbol. These three different types of signs are defined by the specific way they refer to their objects. An icon refers to its object, its referent, through likeness or resemblance. For example, a portrait refers to the actual person depicted in the painting through looking like that person. The semiotic relation between the sign and the referent is one of iconicity: likeness, resemblance, similarity, semblance, imitation, mimicry. An index has a different sort of relation to its referent. Here, the relation is one of a causal or a real connection between the sign and its object. That is, an index indicates or points to its referent. E.g., smoke indicates fire. A symptom points to an illness. This is what is meant by indexicality. Lastly, a symbol is a sign that refers to its object by way of a conventional habit or an arbitrary law. The symbol refers to its referent solely because it has been set up to do so. E.g., the word tree designates actual trees only because the English language has established it to fulfill this function. The symbol cat does not refer to its object through iconicity, resemblance, or through indexicality, causal or real indication. Another example of a symbol is the American flag, since it neither looks like America nor stands in a natural or causal relation to it. Now that we have touched the very basics of Peirce's topology, let's look at how Daniel Chandler helpfully summarizes them for the sake of clarification and expansion. Quote: 1. Symbol, symbolic. A mode in which the signifier does not resemble the signified, but which is fundamentally arbitrary or purely conventional, so that this relationship must be agreed upon and learned, e.g., language in general, plus specific languages, alphabetical letters, punctuation marks, words, phrases, and sentences. Numbers, Morse code, traffic lights, national flags. 2. Icon, iconic. A mode in which the signifier is perceived as resembling or imitating the signified, recognizably looking, sounding, feeling, tasting, or smelling like it, being similar in possessing some of its qualities, e.g., a portrait, a cartoon, a scale model, onomatopoeia, metaphors, realistic sounds in program music, sound effects in radio drama, a dubbed film soundtrack, imitating gestures. 3. Index indexical. A mode in which the signifier is not arbitrary, but is directly connected in some way, physically or causally, to the signified, regardless of intention. This link can be observed or inferred, e.g., natural signs, smoke, thunder, footprints, echoes, non-synthetic odors and flavors, medical symptoms, pain, a rash, pulse rate, measuring instruments, weathercock, thermometer, clock, spirit level, signals, a knock on a door, a phone ringing, pointers, a pointing index finger, a directional signpost, recordings, a photograph, a film, video or television shot, an audio recorded voice, personal trademarks, handwriting, catchphrases. Semiotic the basics, 36 to 37. The phallus is a signifier. But what kind? Icon, index, symbol? In Persian terms, I'm going to argue that the phallus functions as an index, while actually failing to be one. I believe this is what Lacan had in mind, but that Peirce can elucidate. The phallus is not an ordinary index, since it is built on a fundamental deception. More accurately, the phallus is a signifier that pretends to be an index, a simulation of indexicality, a semiotic fake. The phallus is secretly just an illusory index, but one that is perceived with all of the causal naturalness of a true index. The phallus is an empty index. The phallus is an imposture. The phallus is a toupee. This all sounds rather abstract, but we are going to make all of it clear as day in what follows. For Lacan, phallus actually designates two things. 1. A signifier. 2. That signifier's object. In other words, phallus refers to a signifier and its referent. Lacan calls this signifier the symbolic phallus and the phallic signifier, but its referent is usually called the imaginary phallus or just phallus. This can be very confusing and perplexing, so let's make a distinction between the symbolic phallus, phallic signifier, and the substantial phallus, phallic referent. I'm going to be calling the imaginary phallus the substantial phallus for reasons that will become clear. Now, we could simply call the connection between the symbolic phallus and the substantial phallus the phallus, but that would also confuse things, so I'm going to employ the distinction from here on out. Let's get more specific about the two key meanings of phallus. The phallus is 1. The masculine signifier, mark, emblem, indicator, index, and 2. The masculine substance, signified, referent, indicated, pointed to. However, the substantial phallus should not be confused with the real phallus, penis. What we have in mind here with the substantial phallus is the mythological and exceptional substance inside of a man that gives him extraordinary power. The substantial phallus is what makes a man into the man, what guarantees his exceptional identity and status. The substantial phallus is in scare quotes for one significant reason. There is no such thing as the substantial phallus. There is no superpower inside of a man that ontologically separates him from woman and all other men. But this superpower is what the symbolic phallus, the phallic signifier, indicates or refers to. This substantial phallus, the substance, can also be thought of as supreme masculine virility, potency, fullness, vitality, endowment, plenitude, strength, protuberance, etc. Lacan said, quote, "The phallus will become the signifier of power, the scepter, and also owing to which virility can be assumed." End of quote. He then goes on to say that the phallic signifier represents the rise of vital power. The substantial phallus is masculine power. This is why I kept on putting the phallic signifier's referent and object in scare quotes as well. The symbolic phallus is an empty index. It indicates something that is not there. In the terminology of Jean Baudrillard, the phallus is a simulacrum, or a simulation. McGowan himself uses this term to describe the phallus. Quote, "Lacan's insistence that the phallus is a simulacrum rather than a substantial source of identity aligns him with the feminist project and not the patriarchal one." End of quote. Baudrillard's definition of what he called the third-order simulacrum sheds light on the semiotic workings of the phallus. He says, quote, "It masks the absence of a profound reality. It plays at being an appearance. It is of the order of sorcery." End of quote. This third-order simulacrum is like magic, insofar as it makes you see things that aren't even there, which is precisely what the phallic signifier, empty index, does. The symbolic phallus actually masks the absence of a profound reality, which, in this case, is the substantial phallus. But the phallic signifier owes its sorcery to the sham indexicality it utilizes. Perhaps the reason why Baudrillard weaponized the otherness of femininity and its power of seduction was precisely because simulation itself is masculine, and masculinity is simulatory. The phallic signifier simulates having a concrete and substantial referent, phallic power, but this is always a bluff. The order of simulation is a society that also indicates the substantial presence of profound realities, where, in fact, they are missing. Seduction and femininity have a way of exposing the lack in the man, simulacrum. The true phallus is the phallic signifier itself, since there is no phallic substance. This signifier, index, only indicates a void, a negative object, since the true referent is an absence. The relation between smoke and fire is a true index. But what about the simulation of smoke? Do you know that smoke machines don't actually have fires in them that produce the smoke? Most of them work by vaporizing proprietary water and glycol-based or glycerin-based fluids, or through the atomization of mineral oil. The symbolic phallus is a smoke machine. Baudrillard can aid us in understanding the essential role indexicality plays in the functioning of the phallic signifier. Quote, "The question returns to the religion and the simulacrum of divinity. I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples, because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented." Indeed, it can be. But what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons, when it is multiplied in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme power that is simply incarnated in images as a visible theology? Or does it volatilize itself in the simulacra that, alone, deploy their power and pomp of fascination? The visible machinery of icons substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God? This is precisely what was feared by iconoclasts, whose millennial quarrel is still with us today. This is precisely because they have predicted this omnipotence of simulacra. the faculty simulacra have of effacing God from the conscience of man, and the destructive, annihilating truth that they allow to appear. That deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum have ever existed. Even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum. From this came their urge to destroy the images. If they could have believed that these images only obfuscated or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reason to destroy them. One can live with the idea of distorted truth. But their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the image didn't conceal anything at all, and that these images were in essence not images, such as an original model would have made them, but perfect simulacra, forever radiant with their own fascination. Thus this death of the divine referential must be exorcised at all costs. End of quote. To sum up what Baudrillard just said, the idea is that the iconoclasts had a fundamental cognizance of the relation between iconicity, indexicality, and simulation. The reason why Yahweh prohibited any depictions of himself is because they would actually serve as evidence against his existence. In Persian terms, these depictions would have been icons, signs that refer to their objects through resemblance, likeness, etc. To produce an image of God, to make an icon of him, is to throw him into the order of appearances, that is, to put him on the same level as all perceptible objects, which is exactly what God is not. God is spirit, and spirit cannot be represented. It can only be indicated. We could even say that this non-representability is one of God's phallic signifiers. But this signifier is not an icon, but rather an index. We can also view the prophets and their signs and wonders as the phallic signifiers, indexes, of God's Phallus, divine power, insofar as they indicate God's non-representable presence. Yahweh was also very smart to forbid engraven images, representational icons of himself, since the resemblance of God would only prove the absence of a divine referent. Icons of God produce atheists. Instead of the semiotics of the Persian icon, Yahweh always opted for the index. The rainbow after the flood, the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, and the temple are all indexes. They indicate God without representing his likeness. These are technically phallic symbols because of their shape, structure, and design, but not in any obvious way like a sword or an obelisk. Their elongation is horizontal and not vertical. The inconspicuous hint of the phallic shape is what actually makes them more phallic than standard phallic symbols. Also, what an index refers to can remain mysterious and hidden. You don't have to see flames to know that smoke indicates them. Iconicity makes the referent present through resemblance. The indexicality of the phallic signifier complements the simulatory substantial phallus because of how it can sustain the reality of its referent in a mysterious absence. The substantial phallus only works when veiled.